Thomas Weaver knelt beside his hearth, feeding wood into flames that burned just inches above the cabin floor, while 4 faces pressed against his window from the freezing darkness outside. Inside, the temperature had climbed from bone-chilling cold to comfortable warmth in less than 30 minutes, half the time it took Daniel Ashford's traditional elevated fireplace to heat a cabin half this size. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more impossible frontier innovation. The autumn of 1842 brought an early frost to the Wyoming Territory, and with it came the certainty that winter would arrive hard and stay long. Thomas Weaver stood in the clearing he had claimed that spring, surveying the half-finished cabin that would either shelter his family through the brutal months ahead or prove insufficient against the cold that killed settlers with casual regularity. He was 31 years old, a carpenter by training, and possessed of a methodical mind that questioned assumptions others accepted without thought. The cabin's walls were complete, hewn logs fitted with care and chinked against the wind. The roof was solid, layered bark over split planks that would shed snow and rain. What remained was the hearth, and it was this final element that occupied Thomas's thoughts as he walked the perimeter of his structure, measuring distances with his eyes and calculating heat distribution in his mind. He had built fireplaces before. In Pennsylvania, where he had learned his trade, and later in Ohio, where he had worked for 3 years before the promise of western land had drawn him beyond the frontier. Every fireplace he had built followed the same basic design. A firebox elevated 2 to 3 feet above the floor, a narrow opening to concentrate heat, a tall chimney to create draft, red brick or fieldstone, materials that held heat adequately and were readily available. These were the accepted methods, taught by master craftsmen and replicated across thousands of homes. But Thomas had noticed something during his years of building and living with traditional fireplaces. They were inefficient in ways that most people accepted as inevitable. Heat rose, yes, but it rose into the upper reaches of rooms where people did not live. The floor remained cold. The lower 3 feet of living space, where children played and adults worked, stayed chilly even when the upper room grew uncomfortably warm. Traditional fireplaces required constant feeding, consumed enormous amounts of wood, and left occupants cold within an hour of the fire dying down. Thomas had spent the previous winter in a rented cabin near Fort Laramie, and he had paid attention to how heat moved through that space. The elevated fireplace warmed the ceiling area beautifully. The floor stayed cold enough that ice formed in water buckets overnight, despite a roaring fire. His wife Elizabeth had wrapped their infant daughter in every blanket they owned, and still worried about the cold that settled in the lower air. That winter of observation had planted questions in Thomas's mind. What if the accepted design was not the optimal design? What if elevating the firebox was a mistake based on incomplete understanding of how heat actually worked in a confined space? What if there was a better way? He had no formal education in physics or engineering, but he understood carpentry, understood structure, and he had developed an intuition about how materials and space interacted. Thomas found the stone deposit 3 miles north of his claim, exposed in a hillside where erosion had cut through layers of sediment. The stone was gray, ranging from pale ash tones to darker slate shades, and it occurred in relatively flat layers that could be split into usable blocks without excessive effort. He had been searching for building material for 2 weeks, rejecting red clay deposits that would require firing into brick and fieldstone that would need extensive shaping. This gray stone was different. It split along natural fracture lines, creating blocks that were remarkably uniform in thickness. The stone was dense but not brittle, heavy but workable. Thomas broke off a sample piece and held it in his hand, feeling its weight and texture. He built a small fire and placed the stone near the flames, then waited an hour. When he retrieved the stone, it was hot to the touch, but not cracked. More importantly, it retained that heat. He wrapped the stone in cloth and carried it back to his cabin. 4 hours later, the stone was still warm. That night, Thomas explained his plans to Elizabeth. They sat at the rough table he had built, their daughter Sarah sleeping in a cradle nearby. Elizabeth listened as Thomas described the hearth he intended to build, and he watched concern grow in her expression. "Everyone builds fireplaces chest high," she said carefully. "There must be reasons for that." "There are reasons," Thomas agreed. "But I am not convinced they are good reasons." "The Ashfords just finished their cabin," Elizabeth continued. "Daniel built a proper fireplace with red brick he hauled from Fort Bridger. It is beautiful and works well." "It works adequately," Thomas corrected. "I visited last week while Daniel was showing it to Henry Caldwell. The upper room was warm, the floor was cold. Daniel's children were wearing coats inside their own home." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "What if you are wrong?" It was the question Thomas had asked himself repeatedly. What if generations of builders had arrived at the elevated design because it truly was superior? What if his observations were flawed? What if his confidence was actually arrogance? "Then we will be cold this winter," Thomas said, "and I will rebuild the hearth properly in spring. But I do not believe I am wrong." Over the next week, Thomas quarried stone. He used a sledgehammer and iron wedges to split blocks from the hillside, working methodically to create pieces that were approximately the same dimensions. Each block weighed between 20 and 30 pounds. He needed more than 200 blocks for the hearth he envisioned. The work was backbreaking, but Thomas found satisfaction in the steady accumulation of materials. Each block represented a component of his theory, a piece of the structure that would prove or disprove his ideas. He hauled the stones to his cabin using a sledge pulled by his ox, making trip after trip until a substantial pile of gray blocks sat beside his building site. Daniel Ashford arrived on a cool morning in late October, ostensibly to borrow tools but clearly motivated by curiosity. Thomas was laying out the foundation for his hearth when Daniel dismounted and walked over to examine the work. The positioning was immediately obvious. Thomas had marked a location on the cabin's north wall where the firebox would sit barely 8 inches above the floor level. "That cannot be right," Daniel said, his tone friendly but certain. "Your measurements are off." Thomas continued working, using a level to ensure his foundation stones were perfectly horizontal. "The measurements are correct." Daniel crouched down, studying the layout. "Thomas, the firebox needs to be elevated. 2 feet minimum, 3 feet is better. Heat rises. If you build at floor level, all your warmth will escape under the door and through gaps in the floorboards. Heat radiates in all directions before it rises," Thomas said. "The warmth will spread horizontally across the floor first. That is not how fireplaces work." Daniel's voice carried the patience of someone explaining simple facts to a confused child. "I have built 3 fireplaces. My father built dozens in Virginia. The design is standard because the design works." Thomas set down his level and looked at Daniel directly. "Standard design means everyone makes the same mistakes consistently." Daniel laughed, though the sound held no humor. "You think every mason and builder across America has been doing it wrong? That you have discovered something they all missed? I think people repeat what they have been taught without examining whether those teachings are optimal." "And these gray stones?" Daniel picked up one of the blocks, turning it over in his hands. "Why not proper brick? This looks like something you pulled from a creek bed." "That stone retains heat better than brick," Thomas said. "I tested it." "You tested it," Daniel repeated. "Thomas, I say this as your neighbor, and with respect for your carpentry skills. You are making a mistake. When winter comes and this floor-level contraption fails to heat your cabin, you will have wasted weeks of work and put your family at risk. Elizabeth and little Sarah deserve better than an experimental hearth." The mention of his family struck deeper than Daniel probably intended. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that his wife and daughter would suffer if he was wrong. But he also remembered Elizabeth shivering on cold mornings despite a roaring fire in their previous cabin, remembered Sarah's hands turning red from cold even indoors. "I appreciate your concern," Thomas said evenly, "but I will build it as planned." Daniel shook his head, mounting his horse. "Henry Caldwell is coming by my place this afternoon to see my fireplace. You should join us. See how a proper hearth is constructed." Thomas returned to his work without answering. Behind him, he heard Daniel ride away, and he knew the conversation would be repeated throughout the small settlement. The mockery began in earnest 3 days later. Thomas was mixing mortar when Peter Frost and Henry Caldwell arrived together, clearly having coordinated their visit. Henry was the oldest settler in the area, a man whose opinions carried weight based on 62 years of accumulated experience. His presence signaled that Thomas's unconventional construction had become a topic of community concern. "Daniel tells us you are building a floor-level hearth," Henry said without preamble. "I wanted to see it for myself before offering guidance." Thomas gestured toward the partially constructed firebox. The gray stone foundation was complete, and he had begun laying the first courses of the firebox walls. The structure was wide and shallow, stretching nearly 5 feet across, but only 18 inches deep. The opening sat exactly 8 inches above the cabin floor. Henry examined the work in silence for a full minute. Peter walked around the structure, his expression growing more dubious with each step. Finally, Henry spoke. "Son, I have built and used fireplaces for 50 years. In Pennsylvania, in Kentucky, and now out here. What you are building violates every principle of functional fireplace design." "What principles specifically?" Thomas asked. "Heat rises," Henry said, as though this single fact settled all debate. "A firebox at floor level puts your heat source at the coldest point in the room. Cold air settles, your fire will struggle for draft. The heat it produces will immediately sink and dissipate." "Cold air settles because warm air displaces it upward," Thomas countered. "If I introduce heat at the floor level, I warm the cold air directly, rather than letting it remain cold while I heat the ceiling." Peter shook his head. "That gray stone is another problem. Looks like limestone or sandstone. Too soft. It will crack from the heat within a month. You need proper brick or granite." "This stone has better thermal properties than brick," Thomas said. "It absorbs heat faster and releases it more slowly. Where did you learn that?" Henry's tone was sharp. "Did you apprentice with a mason, study engineering, or are you guessing based on feelings?" Thomas set down his trowel. "I tested samples. I observed how different materials held and released heat. The evidence supports my choices." "The evidence," Henry repeated. "Thomas, the evidence is 10,000 fireplaces built across this country using elevated designs with brick or fieldstone. That is your evidence. What you have is a theory that makes you feel clever." "Henry, I mean no disrespect to your experience." "Then take advice from that experience. You have a wife and child depending on this cabin staying warm. Winter here kills people. I have seen families freeze because they were unprepared or made poor decisions about their shelter. This hearth will fail, and when it does, Elizabeth and Sarah will suffer for your stubbornness." The words hit Thomas like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they voiced his own deepest fears. Thomas spent that evening sitting outside his cabin, staring at the unfinished hearth through the open doorway. Elizabeth brought him coffee and sat beside him without speaking. The silence between them was not comfortable. Finally, she broke it. "Henry Caldwell is a good man. He has helped many families survive out here." "I know," Thomas said. "Daniel's fireplace works. I saw it when Rebecca invited me over. Their cabin was warm. The upper half was warm." Elizabeth turned to face him. "Thomas, what if they are right? What if you are risking our family because you want to prove you are smarter than everyone else?" The accusation stung because it touched on something Thomas had wondered himself. Was this about genuine innovation or about his ego? He thought back to the cold mornings in their previous cabin, to the way traditional fireplaces left the living space frigid while heating empty air near the ceiling. He remembered his observations, his tests, his careful reasoning. "I am not doing this to prove I am smart," he said quietly. "I am doing this because I believe it will work better. If I am wrong, I will admit it and fix it. But I need to try." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. "Then finish it," she said. "But finish it quickly. The temperature is dropping every night." Thomas worked with renewed urgency over the following week. He laid course after course of gray stone, building the firebox walls with meticulous care. The wide, shallow design required precise mortar work to ensure stability. Each stone was fitted so that its weight distributed properly to the stones below. The mortar was mixed to exact consistency, thick enough to bond, but not so thick that it created weak joints. The settlement's judgment manifested in various ways. Some neighbors stopped visiting entirely, as though Thomas's project was somehow contagious. Others came specifically to document what they clearly expected to be a spectacular failure. Jacob Miller, a traveling stonemason who was working on a barn for the Ashfords, made a special trip to examine Thomas's work. "I have seen experimental designs before," Jacob said, running his hand along the gray stone. "Usually from men who think tradition is the enemy of progress. They always end the same way. The experimenter admits defeat and hires someone like me to fix his mistakes. This stone is well laid," Thomas said. "Whatever you think of the design, the construction is sound." "Sound construction of a flawed design is still flawed," Jacob replied. "That wide opening will never draft properly. The shallow firebox will smoke, the floor-level position will create cold pockets, and this soft gray stone will deteriorate within a season." After Jacob left, Thomas continued working. He built the chimney using the same gray stone, constructing it with a slight inward taper that would accelerate the rising smoke. He included a smoke shelf, a horizontal ledge that would prevent downdrafts and reflect heat back into the room. The hearth was complete by the third week of November. Thomas had spent 43 days on construction that most men would have finished in 5. Every stone was precisely placed, every mortar joint carefully smoothed. The firebox stretched 5 feet wide and 18 inches deep, its opening a dark mouth positioned just 8 inches above the cabin floor. The chimney rose through the roof, capped with a stone cover that would keep out rain and snow while allowing smoke to escape. Elizabeth stood beside Thomas as he prepared to light the first fire. Sarah was bundled in blankets in her cradle, and the afternoon temperature inside the cabin hovered near freezing. This was the moment that would prove or disprove everything. If the hearth failed to draft, if smoke filled the cabin, if the design proved as flawed as everyone predicted, Thomas would have no defense against the criticism. He had prepared kindling and split wood, arranging them carefully in the wide firebox. The kindling was dry pine, gathered weeks earlier and stored in the driest part of the unfinished cabin. The wood was split oak, dense and slow burning. Thomas struck his flint and steel, sending sparks into the kindling. The tinder caught immediately, small flames spreading through the carefully arranged material. The kindling burned for several minutes, flames growing stronger. Thomas watched the smoke, waiting to see if it would billow into the cabin or draw properly up the chimney. The smoke wavered, seeming uncertain, then began moving upward. The draft was working. Thomas added larger pieces of kindling, then small split wood. The fire grew. Within 10 minutes, flames were burning steadily in the wide firebox. No smoke entered the cabin. The draft was strong and consistent, pulling air across the floor and into the flames. Thomas could feel the draw, a steady current of air moving toward the hearth. He added 2 larger pieces of oak and stepped back. Elizabeth moved closer, holding her hands toward the fire. "It is drawing well," she said, and Thomas heard the relief in her voice. But drawing was only the first test. The critical question was heat distribution. Would the floor-level fire warm the cabin efficiently, or would the heat simply rise and leave the living space cold, as Henry and Daniel had predicted? Thomas had placed a simple thermometer on the cabin wall, a device he had purchased in Fort Laramie specifically for this test. The mercury showed 34 degrees. He noted the time. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The fire burned steadily, consuming wood at what seemed like a reasonable rate. Thomas fed it carefully, maintaining consistent flames without creating a roaring blaze. He wanted to understand the hearth's efficiency, not simply overwhelm the space with excessive heat. After 15 minutes, Elizabeth removed her shawl. "I am warming," she said. Thomas checked the thermometer. 39 degrees. 5 degrees in 15 minutes. He forced himself to remain cautious. Traditional fireplaces also warmed cabins. The question was whether his design performed better. After 30 minutes, the thermometer read 48 degrees. Elizabeth had removed her coat and was working at the table in her regular dress. Sarah had stopped fussing, the infant's innate sensitivity to temperature registering the improving conditions. But what struck Thomas most profoundly was where he felt the warmth. He knelt on the floor near the hearth, placing his hand against the wooden planks. They were warm to the touch. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the ambient air had been. He moved to the center of the cabin and knelt again, still warm. Near the door, the floor remained cool but not frigid. The heat was radiating horizontally across the floor plane before rising. Exactly as he had theorized, Thomas stood and held his hand at chest height. The air was comfortable, but not as warm as the floor level. He reached toward the ceiling, cooler still. The temperature gradient was inverted from what traditional fireplaces created. He was heating the space where his family actually lived, rather than warming empty air above their heads. At 45 minutes, the thermometer showed 56 degrees, 22 degrees of warming in 3/4 of an hour. Thomas had no direct comparison data for traditional fireplaces, but he remembered how long it took to warm their previous cabin. This felt faster, significantly faster. The gray stone was performing exactly as he had hoped. He touched the hearth structure carefully. The stones closest to the fire were hot, but the heat was spreading through the entire mass. The wide, shallow design created maximum surface area for heat absorption. The horizontal courses meant the warmth was radiating outward at floor level rather than concentrating in a narrow column that would rise directly upward. At 1 hour, the thermometer read 61 degrees. The cabin had warmed 27 degrees in 60 minutes. Thomas added 2 more pieces of wood, noting how much fuel he had consumed. Perhaps 8 pieces total, none larger than his forearm. He thought about the massive logs required to keep traditional fireplaces burning hot enough to warm a space. Elizabeth was humming while she prepared their evening meal, something she had not done in weeks. The tension that had filled their home since Thomas began his controversial project seemed to be lifting. Sarah slept peacefully, her blankets looser now that the ambient temperature no longer threatened her comfort. "It is working," Elizabeth said simply. Thomas nodded, but he knew this was only the beginning of proof. One successful fire on a moderately cold afternoon did not validate his design. He needed to demonstrate consistent performance across varying conditions. He needed to show fuel efficiency over extended periods. He needed to prove the hearth would function during the brutal cold of deep winter. But for this moment, watching his wife move comfortably through their warm cabin while their daughter slept peacefully, Thomas allowed himself to believe he might have been right. The floor beneath his feet radiated gentle heat, and the sea-bullseye gray stones glowed with absorbed warmth. The true test came 3 weeks later, on a night when the temperature plummeted to depths that challenged every cabin in the settlement. The date was December 9th, 1842, and the cold arrived with a clarity that made the stars seem close enough to touch. By evening, frost formed on the inside of windows throughout the territory. Animals huddled in barns. Settlers piled every blanket they owned onto their beds and fed their fireplaces constantly, fighting against cold that found every gap and weakness in their structures. Thomas woke at midnight to check the fire. The thermometer read 58 degrees inside the cabin, and the fire had burned down to coals. He added 3 pieces of wood and returned to bed. At 2 in the morning, Elizabeth woke him. "Thomas, listen." Through the cabin walls came sounds from the Ashford place, a quarter-mile distant. Voices, movement. The unmistakable noise of crisis. Thomas dressed quickly and went outside. The cold hit him like a physical force, stealing his breath. He could see lamplight in the Ashford cabin, unusual for the middle of the night. He returned inside and added more wood to his fire. Within minutes, the flames were strong again. Within 15 minutes, the cabin temperature had climbed back to 63 degrees. Thomas stood at his window, watching the distant lamplight, and wondered what was happening. He learned the details the next morning when Daniel appeared at his door, his face haggard from sleeplessness. Behind him stood Peter Frost, Henry Caldwell, and Jacob Miller. All 4 men looked exhausted. "The temperature inside my cabin dropped to 38 degrees last night. Daniel said without greeting. "I kept the fire blazing all evening, used half a cord of wood, and still could not keep the cold out. Rebecca and the children were freezing despite being wrapped in every blanket we own. We nearly had to abandon our home and shelter with the Caldwells." Peter spoke next. "My cabin reached 40 degrees, same situation. Fire roaring, wood disappearing, family freezing." Henry Caldwell, who had lectured Thomas so severely about proper fireplace design, said nothing. He simply looked at the interior of Thomas's cabin, at Elizabeth working comfortably in a light dress, at Sarah playing on a blanket spread across the warm floor. "What was your temperature last night?" Daniel asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "It dropped to 58 degrees around midnight," Thomas said. "I added wood twice. Used perhaps 10 pieces total through the night." Jacob Miller walked to the hearth and knelt beside it, placing his hand on the gray stone. "Still warm," he said quietly. "Hours after the fire burned down, the stones are still radiating heat." Daniel looked at Thomas with an expression that combined exhaustion, frustration, and something approaching desperation. "I need you to show me how you built this." By afternoon, 7 families had visited Thomas's cabin. Word of the previous night's temperature crisis had spread through the settlement with the speed that important news always traveled in isolated communities. Men who had mocked Thomas's design 3 weeks earlier now stood in his home, feeling the warmth radiating from his floor. Examining the gray stone hearth with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed embarrassment, Thomas explained his design methodically, walking each visitor through the reasoning behind every choice. The floor-level positioning that allowed heat to radiate through the living space rather than rising immediately to the ceiling. The wide, shallow firebox that created maximum surface area for combustion and heat transfer. The gray stone selected specifically for its thermal properties, its ability to absorb heat quickly during active burning and release it slowly over hours. "The stone is the key," Thomas said, running his hand along the better gray blocks. "Red brick is adequate for containing fire, but this limestone absorbs and holds heat far more effectively. These stones are still warm from this morning's fire, and it is now past midday." Henry Caldwell knelt beside the hearth, his aged joints protesting the movement. He placed both hands on the stones, holding them there for a long moment. "I was wrong," he said simply. 50 years of building fireplaces, and I was wrong about fundamental principles." The admission carried weight. Henry was not a man who acknowledged error lightly. His words seemed to release tension that had been building in the room. Other men nodded, their own skepticism crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence. "How long did this take you to build?" Peter Frost asked. 43 days, Thomas said. "Most of that time was quarrying and shaping the stone." "And a traditional fireplace takes 4 or 5 days, Daniel said, "but uses 3 times the wood and provides half the warmth." He shook his head. "The time investment is worthwhile if the result is this superior." Margaret Frost, Peter's wife, had been standing quietly near Elizabeth. Now she spoke. "Our children were crying from cold last night. I was terrified. If your design can prevent that, then the time it takes to build is irrelevant." Over the next hour, Thomas sketched his design on paper, creating crude drawings that showed the dimensions and proportions. He explained the importance of the stone's thermal properties, suggested where similar gray limestone might be quarried, and detailed the mortar mixture he had used. The men asked technical questions about draft, about smoke management, about structural stability. Thomas answered each query with the patience of someone who had thought through every aspect of his design. Rebecca Ashford approached Elizabeth in the corner where the women had gathered. "I apologize for doubting your husband. Daniel came home from his first visit here saying Thomas was building something foolish. I believed him. We were wrong." Elizabeth smiled. Thomas knew he was taking a risk, but he also knew what he had observed. Sometimes one person seeing clearly is worth more than many people repeating the same mistakes. The winter of 1842 to 1843 became known in the settlement as the Winter of the Gray Hearths. By February, 4 families had begun construction of floor-level fireplaces using Thomas's design. By the following autumn, 11 cabins featured the distinctive wide, shallow hearths built with gray limestone quarried from the hillside Thomas had discovered. The design spread not through promotion or persuasion, but through the simple logic of survival. Families who adopted the innovation stayed warmer, used less wood, and suffered fewer illnesses related to cold exposure. Thomas helped where he could, offering advice on stone selection, demonstrating proper mortar techniques, and explaining the thermal principles that made the design effective. He never charged for his assistance. The knowledge was freely given, just as the observation and reasoning that produced it had been freely developed. Some builders modified the design slightly, adapting it to their specific circumstances or available materials. Thomas encouraged experimentation. The core principles remained consistent across variations. Low positioning, wide firebox, thermal mass stone, horizontal heat radiation. Daniel Ashford's new hearth, completed in March of 1843, became the second example of the design in the settlement. Daniel worked alongside Thomas during construction, learning techniques he had dismissed as foolish just months earlier. The friendship between the two men, strained by disagreement and vindication, gradually rebuilt itself on the foundation of mutual respect. Daniel never explicitly apologized for his mockery, but his actions spoke clearly. He became one of the most vocal advocates for the gray hearth design, sharing his experience with new settlers and travelers passing through the territory. By 1845, the distinctive floor-level hearths had spread beyond the immediate settlement. Trappers, traders, and travelers carried descriptions of the unusual but effective fireplace design to other communities. References to weaver hearths or gray stone hearths began appearing in letters and journals from across the Wyoming and Montana territories. The innovation had achieved what all successful frontier adaptations achieved. It solved a genuine problem better than existing methods, and people adopted it because it worked. Thomas and Elizabeth's family grew. Sarah was joined by two brothers, born in 1844 and 1846. The cabin that had been built with such controversy became a home filled with warmth in both literal and figurative senses. The gray hearth that had provoked mockery became the center of family life, a source of heat and comfort that required less wood and less attention than traditional designs. Henry Caldwell, in a letter written to relatives in Pennsylvania in 1847, described the evolution of fireplace design in the territory. He wrote honestly about his initial skepticism and his eventual recognition that younger men with fresh perspectives sometimes saw truths that experience had obscured. The letter included detailed drawings of Thomas's hearth design with a note that these plans should be shared with anyone building in cold climates. Thomas Weaver never sought recognition for his innovation. He built furniture, helped neighbors with construction projects, raised his children, and lived quietly. But on cold nights throughout the Wyoming Territory, families gathered around floor-level hearths built with gray stone, staying warm with half the wood their parents had burned, and the design that had seemed wasteful became simply the way things were done. Innovation had become tradition, proven by the simplest measure that mattered. It worked better, and people who were cold wanted to be warm.